The Turkey of 2022 is a shadow of its former self. Democracy is under siege, the economy is in crisis. Inflation has hit 36%, the highest in 20 years. Youth unemployment is at 25%. Turkey has locked up more journalists than China, and its relations with the West are in tatters. That is the Turkey of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan in 2022. But it wasn't always that way. In the 2000s, Erdoğan presided over one of the greatest expansions in the Turkish economy in its history. Poverty was cut in half, and Turkey was well on its way to becoming a member of the European Union. Erdoğan was also the first Turkish leader to put Kurdish civil rights on the agenda. So what changed? How did Erdoğan undermine Turkey's institutions, its democracy, and eventually its economy? With elections coming up in 2023, is Erdoğan's brand of authoritarian populism on its way out, or will the elections be rigged? In short, this video will cover the rise and fall of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Many of you are not subscribed, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification. After all, it's free to subscribe. Atatürk's Republic. To understand how Erdoğan undermined it, we have to understand the state of Turkish democracy before his rise. Many people know that Turkey's founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, established Turkey as a secular republic. What many people don't know, however, is that Atatürk's republic has for much of its history not been very democratic, and the Turkish form of secularism is far more far-reaching and invasive than the secularism we see in most Western liberal democracies. In most Western secular societies, you have freedom of religion. The government may not favor or impose any religion, and the people are free to express religion freely. But in Atatürk's Turkey, there was freedom from religion, which meant that rather than the government being neutral towards religion, the government would control religion. Atatürk did not only abolish Sharia law or make women equal under the law, but he abolished the Arabic alphabet. Religious schools were shut down, the government banned the wearing of the fez, turbans, the niqab, and the burqa, and women were not allowed to wear the hijab in public places. He also established the Diyanet, a government ministry that would control religion, with all imams in Turkey becoming government employees and the government controlling what they could and could not preach. Atatürk's revolution was a top-down revolution imposed on a mostly illiterate peasant society. In order to preserve Atatürk's vision after his death and the introduction of Turkish democracy in 1950, in what was still a mostly conservative Islamic society, the military was established as the guardian of a secular Turkey, and they were given the right to intervene in Turkish politics if Atatürk's secular constitution was ever threatened. Since the introduction of democracy in 1950, there have been at least 5 military coups in Turkey. In 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997, and 2016. Turkish democracy was therefore defined by an impossible contradiction, using the force of the military to protect democracy from itself. Turkey's invasive secular laws meant that women who wore a headscarf could never attend university or run for public office. Female MPs who wore the hijab were hounded out of parliament by their jeering male colleagues. The way in which outwardly religious Turks were prevented from advancing in society produced an underlying resentment at Turkey's secular elites and Turkey's heavy-handed form of secularism, which produced a fertile ground for the rise of Islamist politics. Now, it's important to note that Turkish Islamists were far more moderate than their Arabic counterparts, being much closer in their politics to the American Christian right than the Taliban. The first breakthrough happened in 1995 when the Islamist Welfare Party of Necmettin Erbakan won the elections. But in 1997, the military sent tanks into the streets, which immediately forced the Islamists to step down. The Islamic Welfare Party was banned, and Erdoğan, who had served as mayor of Istanbul for the party, was imprisoned for 1 year. What this experience taught Erdoğan was that if he was ever to gain power again, he could not make the same mistakes as Erbakan. He had to act cautiously so as not to antagonize the military to overthrow him. The Rise of Erdoğan. In the 1990s, Turkey was in the midst of a political and economic crisis. The country had a series of 6 unstable coalition governments and 4 economic crises, with inflation that peaked at 105%, much higher than today. Erdoğan took this as an opportunity. He reformed the Islamic Welfare Party into the Justice and Development Party, the AKP. He toned down the Islamist rhetoric and rebranded himself as a conservative Democrat or a Muslim Democrat, just like you have Christian Democrats in Europe. Campaigning on the economy as part of a big tent center-right coalition, Erdoğan won the 2002 elections with 36% of the vote, but he won a 2/3 majority in parliament, becoming prime minister in 2003. Erdoğan's new government immediately set about trying to fix the Turkish economy. Erdoğan sliced 6 zeros off of the Turkish lira, and inflation dropped from 53.5% in 2001 to 21.9% in 2003, and eventually stabilized around 7%. With inflation back under control, foreign investors regained their confidence in the Turkish economy and began pouring money back into the country, with foreign investment peaking at $22 billion in 2007. Erdoğan restructured Turkey's meager welfare state, ending the long waiting lines for free healthcare and improving the quality of education for millions of Turks. And as a result of these policies, infant mortality was cut in half and life expectancy increased from 70 in 2000 to 75 by 2014. Reduction of the inflation rate also granted people access to mortgages, which allowed millions of people from Turkey's rising middle classes to buy their own homes for the first time. Erdoğan seemed to be facilitating an economic miracle. Erdonomics was working, and it made the AKP massively popular, winning election after election after election. Erdoğan also embraced some progressive policies. Erdoğan was the first Turkish leader to allow gay pride parades. He was also the first Turkish leader to embrace Kurdish civil rights. While previously the Kurdish language had been banned and the government had been at war with the PKK, a separatist militant group, Erdoğan decided to embrace the Kurds in order to win their votes. He set up Turkey's first Kurdish language TV station and began peace talks with the PKK. But this reformist mask would slowly begin to slip. Erdoğan's religious policy initially focused on reasonable efforts to expand religious freedom. For the first time, Turkish women could wear a headscarf and still go to university. These reforms were fairly reasonable, but quite controversial in Atatürk's secular republic. But it didn't stop there. Erdoğan began efforts to Islamize the country. He built over 9,000 mosques between 2005 and 2015. He began converting many of Turkey's secular public schools into Islamic Imam Hatip schools, with the number of students attending Imam Hatip schools increasing from just 60,000 in 2002 to 1.5 million by 2016. In 2014, the government introduced mandatory courses on Islam in all public schools, and the new policy allowed the government to instantly replace school administrators with people from conservative trade unions affiliated with the AKP. These educational policies were part of an effort to raise a devout generation and Islamize Turkey. These kind of policies very quickly put Erdoğan at odds with the military and secular institutions like the courts and the media. In 2007, the military issued an online warning to Erdoğan after he nominated Abdullah Gül to be president. Gül's wife wore a headscarf, and Gül himself supported overturning the headscarf ban. But Erdoğan called their bluff and refused to back down. The military did nothing. Then in 2008, Turkey's Constitutional Court launched a case to ban the AKP. Erdoğan realized that he did not have much time if he was to survive politically, and he had to consolidate power if he was to avoid the same fate as Erbakan and the Islamic Welfare Party. Strongman in the making. If Erdoğan was ever to be safe from a military coup and the power of the secular state, he would have to undermine and take over Turkey's institutions from the inside out, including the military, the courts, the media, and civil society. To help with this, he formed an alliance with the Gülen movement. This movement, started by Islamic preacher Fethullah Gülen, was a religious movement that also operated many schools in Turkey. But rather than just teaching children religion, these schools were actually renowned for their high-quality education, and they taught a largely secular content but with religious values, and graduates of Gülen schools were encouraged to make careers and gain important positions in society, not just focusing on Islam. The first target was the military. In the late 2000s, Erdoğan began negotiations for Turkey to join the European Union. But this was purely instrumental. You see, the EU imposed many roadblocks on Turkey that Erdoğan knew that they would never be allowed into the EU. However, the EU does have certain requirements, including having a democracy that is free from intervention by the military in politics. So Erdoğan used the prospect of joining the EU as a justification for removing the influence of the military from Turkish politics without triggering a coup. Then came the Ergenekon trials. In 2008, rumors about a conspiracy to plot a coup against Erdoğan led to a witch hunt. While there was likely some truth to this, Erdoğan used the Ergenekon trials to detain hundreds of military officers, journalists, academics, and others who he saw as a threat under the guise of trying to find the coup plotters. Through this process, he was greatly able to weaken the military. Because of Erdoğan's continued popularity and the fact that Turkey was still trying to join the EU, the military did not react, and in 2011 there was a mass resignation of secular military officers. These officers were then replaced by AKP supporters from the Gülen movement. The next target was Turkey's secular courts. In 2010, Erdoğan organized a constitutional referendum that brought in several changes, including giving the president the power to appoint judges. The AKP then expanded the constitutional court from 11 to 17 and packed it with loyal AKP judges. The High Council of Judges and Prosecutors, which is supposed to act as a check on the courts, had its membership increased from 12 to 34 and packed with Erdogan loyalists, mostly from the Gülen movement. The next target was the media. In 2009, the Doğan Media Group, a secular liberal media conglomerate, was charged with tax evasion and given a fine of $2.5 billion, more than the entire value of the company. Unable to pay the fine, the owners were forced to sell the company to a pro-Erdoğan businessman. The strategy was simple. Erdoğan would charge the owners of opposition media outlets with politically motivated charges, then hand the media company over to a national regulator. The national regulator would then sell the company to an Erdoğan supporter who would buy it with a loan from a state-owned bank. And slowly, one by one, Turkey's newspapers and television networks were bought up by Erdoğan supporters. In 2002, less than a quarter of Turkish media was pro-AKP. By 2011, pro-AKP businesses owned 50% of Turkish media, and today 90% of Turkish media is in the hands of pro-AKP businessmen. The few journalists who still dare to criticize Erdoğan are regularly thrown in jail. In fact, Turkey imprisons more journalists than China, a country 16 times its size. Erdoğan used the Gülen movement to infiltrate all of Turkey's institutions. Gülenists set up their own media organizations and educational institutions, and Gülenists joined the ranks of the police, the military, and the judiciary. It's important to note that Erdoğan's capture of Turkish institutions was greatly helped by Turkey's 10% electoral threshold. You see, Erdoğan rarely won more than 50% of the vote, but each time received massive majorities in parliament, enabling him to make the changes he wanted, even with only a minority of the vote. There was real opposition to Erdoğan's policies, and that opposition exploded in 2013. A small protest by environmentalists in Gezi Park against the closing of the park to make way for the construction of a shopping mall was met with major police brutality. This triggered a much larger protest movement against Erdoğan's autocratic policies. Protesters occupied the park for weeks on end, and protests spread to over 70 different cities and towns across Turkey. Erdoğan cracked down with brutal force on these protests, and it showed the power of grassroots protests to oppose Erdoğan. That same year, a massive corruption scandal exposed Erdoğan and led to the arrest of dozens of people connected to the AKP. Erdoğan believed that Fethullah Gülen was behind the exposing of Erdoğan's corruption. This led to the end of the alliance between the AKP and the Gülen movement. Erdoğan increasingly cracked down on the Gülen movement as well, and Gülenists became increasingly critical of Erdoğan's government, until finally Erdoğan declared that the Gülen movement was a terrorist organization and began arresting Gülen-affiliated journalists. The Gülenists realized that they were cornered, and on July 15, 2016, they attempted to launch a military coup against Erdoğan. This was the first coup attempt which was done not by the secular military officers but by Gülenists. The coup itself was poorly organized, poorly timed, and only included one element of the military, the Gülenists. When tanks rolled onto the streets, Erdoğan mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to flood the streets to prevent the coup. This was Turkey's 9/11 moment, and Turkish citizens rallied behind Erdoğan, with his approval rating surging to 70%. Using the coup as an excuse, Erdoğan crushed anyone believed to be associated with the coup, Gülenist or not, and consolidated his power. More than 60,000 police and military personnel and 125,000 civil servants were fired or suspended. 1/3 of the judiciary was dismissed. More than 90,000 citizens were arrested or imprisoned, and more than 1,500 non-governmental organizations were shut down. The final nail in the grave of Turkish democracy came in 2017. Before 2017, the Turkish presidency was largely ceremonial, with the prime minister being head of government and the president being head of state. Having served as prime minister for 3 terms, Erdoğan ran for president in 2014. In 2017, he organized a referendum to change the constitution to abolish the position of prime minister and give all executive power to the president, including the power to rule by decree. With 90% of the media under Erdoğan's control, coverage was skewed massively in favor of the yes vote. The AKP received over 300 hours to campaign on public TV, while the secular CHP was given just 45 hours, the ultra-nationalist MHP 15 hours, and the pro-Kurdish HDP 0. The courts, now under Erdoğan's control, allowed non-stamped ballots to be accepted as valid, making the vote vulnerable to electoral fraud. On top of that, the state of emergency from the 2016 coup attempt was still in force, granting Erdoğan additional powers to clamp down on opposition, which he used to arrest the leaders of the pro-Kurdish HDP. As a result, the yes vote won by 51%. Turkey was now effectively an elected dictatorship. Erdonomics. Erdoğan's consolidation of power had destroyed Turkey's democracy. What Erdoğan would do next would destroy its economy too. Erdoğan's attempts to rig the political system in his favor also began to find its way into his economic policy. A big part of Erdoğan's strategy to grow the Turkish economy involved using debt to fuel growth. Erdoğan significantly reduced interest rates as a way to encourage Turkish businesses and households to take on debt in order to invest into infrastructure, expanding businesses and building houses, fueling economic growth. And as long as the value of the Turkish lira remained strong, it was easy for Turkish businesses to pay back this debt, which was denominated in US dollars. But that changed in 2018 when the arrest of an American pastor and Turkey's purchase of Russian missile systems caused Trump to place sanctions on Turkish steel and aluminium. This caused the value of the Turkish lira to plunge by 20% against the dollar, making it much more expensive for Turkish businesses to pay back their dollar debt, forcing them to raise prices, leading to increasing inflation up to 16%. On top of that, low interest rates, because they make it easier to borrow money, put more money into circulation, which further increases inflation. At this point, the central bank should have raised interest rates, which would have made it more expensive to borrow, therefore discouraging businesses from taking on too much debt and reducing the amount of money in circulation, decreasing inflation. Instead, Erdoğan chose to further decrease interest rates. When the central bank governor refused, Erdoğan fired him. Erdoğan would go on to fire a total of 3 central bank governors in the space of 2 years, who refused to keep lowering interest rates. Now, officially, Turkey's central bank is supposed to be independent, but Erdogan's capture of all of Turkey's political institutions meant that he had free rein. This policy of continuing to lower interest rates during a time of inflation only served to increase inflation and lower the value of the Turkish lira. On top of that, the coronavirus pandemic hurt Turkish exports and destroyed the tourism sector, which had brought a lot of money into the economy. So if this policy kept failing, why did Erdogan keep doing it? Erdogan believes that low interest rates and an undervalued lira are a good thing, because an undervalued lira would increase Turkish exports by making them cheaper, and make Turkey a cheaper and therefore more attractive tourist destination. Now, this is true. China has boosted its exports by devaluing its currency, but that only works as long as inflation is low and in an export-oriented country. Turkey, however, unlike China, also imports a lot, and with a devalued currency, those imports become more expensive. On top of that, Erdogan believes that it is high interest rates, not low interest rates, which cause inflation. Now, this is ludicrous because low interest rates encourage people to borrow and spend more, which increases prices, increasing inflation. Finally, Islam condemns usury and therefore high interest rates, and so Erdogan's Islamist political ideology is likely another motivation for his stubborn refusal to raise interest rates. Regardless, this policy has had disastrous effects. In the year 2021 alone, the Turkish lira lost 45% of its value. Inflation surged to 36%, the highest in 20 years. Electricity costs have increased by 125% for commercial customers and 50% for residential customers. The cost of public transport in Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, has increased by more than 30%. The basic costs of life are becoming unaffordable for the average Turkish citizen. Erdogan's popularity was built on the massive economic success he brought to Turkey. But with the economy in crisis and elections scheduled for 2023, it seems only a matter of time before the same economy becomes Erdogan's undoing. The Fall of Erdoğan. As we speak, the prospects for Erdogan's re-election don't look good. This election will be about the economy, and 78% of Turks said their confidence in the government's economic policy had decreased, while 64% do not believe that Erdogan's government will be able to resolve the current economic problems. It's no surprise then that Erdogan's approval rating has plummeted to 38%, the lowest since June 2015. Yet in 2015, Erdogan still managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and turn around his approval ratings before the elections. However, in 2015, the economy wasn't in freefall and the opposition was weak and divided. But in 2022, things have changed. As early as 2019, cracks in Erdogan's hold over the political system had begun to show. In the 2019 local elections, the opposition secured shock victories in major metropolitan areas, including Turkey's two largest cities, Istanbul and Ankara. Erdogan now has a host of opposition parties that can challenge him. Turkey's political landscape is dominated by 5 parties. Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, AKP, is a right-wing conservative party with Islamist tendencies. His coalition partners are the Nationalist Movement Party, MHP, a far-right ultra-nationalist party. In the opposition benches, there is the Republican People's Party, CHP, which is the party of Atatürk and embraces the Kemalist ideology with a broadly center-left secular position. Most of their support comes from secular urban areas. Then there is the Good Party, a center-right, secular and pro-European party. Finally, there is the People's Democratic Party, HDP, a left-wing party that supports Kurdish civil rights, feminism and LGBT rights, and is predominantly supported by the Kurds in the southeast of the country. So which of these is in a position to oust Erdogan? While in 2015 the opposition was weak and divided, today Erdogan is outpolled by at least 3 major opposition leaders. The mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş, from the CHP, polls at 60%. The mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, also from the CHP, polls at 51%, and Meral Akşener from the Good Party polls at 39%, while Erdoğan polls at just 38%. What the opposition lacked in the past, they now have. Not one, but two charismatic leaders and a failing economy that needs fresh leadership. Yet looking at polls and charismatic leaders leaves out one thing: rigging. Erdoğan has managed to infiltrate every single Turkish institution. While the elections in Turkey are still relatively free, they are anything but fair. With 90% of the media on his side, control over the courts, the military and other institutions, it's a major uphill battle for the opposition. On top of that, there is evidence that Erdoğan will not accept defeat if he loses the election. In March 2019, when Ekrem İmamoğlu won the mayoral election in Istanbul by a razor-thin margin of 48.8% to the AKP's 48.6%, Erdoğan declared that the election was invalid and had the Supreme Electoral Council nullify the result. However, when the election was rerun in June, İmamoğlu won by an even bigger margin, with 54% to the AKP's 45%. This shows that when faced with defeat, Erdoğan, like Trump, will try to nullify the results of the election. Unlike Trump, however, he actually has the institutional power to get it done. The only thing that can overcome this is an overwhelming electoral victory for the opposition. But even if the opposition wins, Turkish democracy has been so thoroughly hollowed out by Erdoğan that it will need to be rebuilt from the ground up. Turkish opposition parties have already agreed that they will abolish the presidential system that Erdoğan introduced in 2017, which concentrates all power in one man, and return to parliamentary democracy. This is supported by the Turkish people, with just 34% in favor of the presidential system and 57% in favor of returning to parliamentary democracy. The opposition will have to restore Turkey's checks and balances to prevent the concentration of power in one man and one party from ever happening again. Yet, Erdoğan's legacy was still important. Not only did he turn Turkey into a developed country economically, but the power of the military had to be broken, and some kind of relaxation of Turkey's heavy-handed secular laws was needed. However, Erdoğan has overcorrected and gone too far, choosing to pursue Islamization and concentration of power. However, if Erdoğan is ousted, Turkey will be free to pursue a real democracy, free from both the undemocratic intervention of an overbearing secularist military and the authoritarian populism of an Islamist party. This will be the real achievement of Atatürk's dream for a secular, free, democratic Turkey. YouTube has been demonetizing my videos, so consider becoming a Patreon to support the channel. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons, including Ben, Matthias, Linda, Richard, Eisenskjold, and many more for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.